Greetings, everyone. Hi there. I'm Clifford Bates again, and this is a video in response. Well, this is a video from some kind of responding to a live stream I kind of joined in on. I didn't mean to. I was going to get into a discussion of it with some people. I'm not going to name names, but they'll know who they are. My title for this is Thoughts on Political Anthropology, Sociology, Political and Social Economy. Hence subtitle responding to a live stream on economy and society that pissed me off. By pissing me off, I would have to say that it forced me to confront certain understandings, and I want to explain certain things of how we understand politics and how do we understand things like economy and society. What do they mean? And often this is the problem with YouTube debates. There's just almost like this, let's have a debate, debates, and we have a whole bunch of people who are basically amateurs about these things, or students, and they think that they understand these things in a certain way, and they can one argue, or they can point to something and say, "Oh, that's how it is," and that kind of, well, it's annoying because for an argument to work, for a debate to work, you have to have certain terms of agreement. The problem is some things you cannot, I'm sorry. If someone's going to stick to a dogmatic Marxist understanding of something, then there's no point. That person is a true believer, and you can't argue with true believers. You just have to accept. The only thing you can do to them is ignore them or kill them. You can't really argue with them in that sense. This is the danger of true believers and people possessed by ideological mindsets. It's pointless to even debate with them. There's no room for arguments. Arguments and persuasion only works when people you're engaging with them in a discussion, and then you have to have, for this discussion to work, you have to have the clear definitions, and we have to have agreement on what the words in themes mean. If that doesn't happen, then it ain't gonna work. Well, this little talk today is going to be based on me trying to explain this a little bit and work on it. Now, here's my next slide. I want to talk about political anthropology a little bit. What is it? Political anthropology is trying to understand the nature of how political organizations and institutions emerged over time. It's understanding it from the anthropological point of view. In other words, the understanding of man's evolution as a being, as an animal. Okay, human beings are animals in the sense. Human beings are social animals or political animals in the sense that we have a nature that requires it. And that if we look at human history and human interaction, we see that there's a kind of trajectory of human development. That will basically fund and shape all political development. Now, since this is above 18 or above 21, this is my little bourbon for the night, so I can enjoy this a little more. Political anthropology is about human beings and their evolution, and we find human beings as human beings emerging in the first stage of the rise of the hunter-gatherers. Now, hunter-gatherers are basically, and actually much of human development, early primitive man is hunter-gathering in that sense. They rise off the land and the rivers. They live off either. Up here I have A and B. What is missing here is the basic thrust of the hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers live off the land. They hunt and gather. They collect shrubbery. They collect food that grows naturally in the environment. Anything that grows that occurs in the prairies or the wild that is edible, like mushrooms or fruits or berries and things. The gatherers emerge here, and then the other thing is they hunt animals to eat. So the hunting of animals. Now, hunter-gatherer society is a society that basically follows the food. It follows the food. We'll talk about this some more. In other words, hunter-gatherer doesn't have a notion of property or land, they go where the food, and they mobile. Also, the ecology of hunter-gatherers, and remember, hunter-gatherers are fundamentally things like the North American Indian tribes. These are hunter-gatherer societies. They did not develop advanced agriculture. They did not even attempt really. Many of the tribes persisted on hunting as the way of life. Other aspects of not hunting animals, then hunting as the next level is hunting of sea and rivers, hunting of fish and in other words, that's another aspect of hunter gathering. Living off the rivers, and lakes and oceans, and the food that comes from that, the food that can be hunted or gathered by that approach. And the last criteria of the hunter-gatherers is the hunting of men, either by hunting them for the purposes of eating them, cannibalism, or the hunting of them in the sense that to ensure that you and yours have the hunt of the land. You're competing with other groups for the animals, okay? So therefore you hunt them to ensure that you and yours can enjoy the animals and food if you find in the path you take, in the direction you take. Sometimes you avoid it. In fact, this is Rousseau's famous line that people were so afraid of each other at certain times, it didn't really engage in conflict. Only time you engaged in conflict is when you had some kind of society, something to lose in that sense. So and thus when hunter-gatherers, often they saw the other people, they'd go into different directions. But if there was no other directions and this is where the food went, then they'd be forced to fight and they would be forced to compete. We can see this very much the case in, even though there may not be the specific claiming of land, there is a kind of, this is my area. This is my area where our tribe or my group goes. We see this in the apes, the higher apes, with apes, waging wars. This is the infamous chimpanzee wars that is talked about in the anthropological literature. From the hunter-gatherers, then we move the cultivating of animals. In other words, instead of hunting them, we tame a certain or domesticate a certain animals that they consume, goats, cows and things like this, that animals that you cultivate, you control for food. Often you have to feed them, and in a sense, therefore, you take them on the journey to eat. They eat the food, they eat things to grow, and then when it's time for you to eat, hungry, or your group that needs to be fed, you slay animals and you learn how to, preserve aspects of food, preserve it so that you can travel with the group. Shepherds and herders tend to be nomadic, as much as nomadic as hunter-gatherers. So again, this is still nomadic. Human beings only it's the next stage, the agrarian farming stage. And this stage is where human beings create territory. It is at this stage that people seek to declare property, that this land is ours. We're going to be there for this piece of land that we're cultivating, we're growing things on, is ours, mine, private property in that sense. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And then the last stage of this is the rise of commerce, trading, exchange. The rise of commerce dominating the product, and this is the rise of industry or productiveness, production to making goods and services in industrial society, and then we can say the information or service economy society as well. But in a way, the service economy and the production economy was always there. Is that the intensity of each will grow at different times because of the different technologies. Access to technologies that will happen over time. I want to now turn to this thing. This is the units of cooperation. The human units of cooperation. The initial one, of course, is the family. The family is between the husband, wife, spouse, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, cousins, and this is the family. The family bond forms into and merges. The next element is the band. The band is different from the family in that you often this will be heads of different families would bond together as a band to accomplish something. This is, we can say this is before the village. This is the pre-village thing. Villages only emerge per se after agrarian moment. So therefore, in the hunter-gatherer and even in the nomadic stage, the band is going to be the primary entity. The village emerges only out of the development. Two things emerge: the household, the estate, and the village emerges out of the agrarian stage. In other words, the social bond elaborates first in terms of the household. I don't mention the household. The household is not the family. The household is the family is part of a household or the estate. It also involves servants, the relationship. Yes, the family relationship, that of husband, wife, parent, child, siblings, extended siblings, grandparents, and so forth. This bondage structure is within the family, and it exists in the household, or the Greek word oikos, the oikos, the household. The household also involves relationships with servants and slaves. So therefore, there is the idea of not only is the family involved, but then the servants and the slaves who work on the estate. And then therefore, the last aspect is so therefore it engages in a kind of labor activity or activities in there. So servants and slaves who are connected in there. So therefore, the household is a weird. The household differs from the family. It is a complex with different types of relationships. The band, and it usually occurs only within after once we get into agrarian life, where we have property, we have landed populations that do it this way, and a couple of households will form a village. Okay, the village will collectively work together. Now, the village emerges out of a stage, but then, and therefore this little hierarchy here is kind of misleading, because I would argue that the next thing after the family, the clan will logically emerge. The family comes up. This is what is this? This is the extended family of multiple groups of third, fourth, fifth cousins out. And that this ultimately creates the next stage out of the tribe, which is that same principle larger, writ large, up to like I said, usually the clan will normally have two or three different steps from the family. In other words, at least two different steps of cousins, two or three. The tribe will have up to 10 or 15. Okay, the tribe is the tribe also gather inside. Some tribes will grow so big, there's a thing, a tribe will grow, and this is what tribes are connected to. Clans and tribes are also occurring both in the agrarian, but also occurs in the hunter-gatherers. The hunter-gatherer tribes, often the bands will go out and work in things, but usually the tribe as a whole will be the unit of action. And therefore, the size of the tribe will depend upon the ability of the group to feed itself and to survive. That's limits. In fact, remember, this is why we have to understand most hunter-gatherer tribes, the populations of these groups are not that big. At most, the typical tribe will have no more than 300 to 400 to 500 people in it, no more, because anything larger, in fact, they would break up at that stage. If you had over like 1,000 or 2,000 size unit, you'd have to break up into small go into different regions, because you just in other words, the amount of food that you could gather from the nature itself and animals to hunt would be, you'd scare them away. That'd be gone. So you need to have you couldn't get too big. So therefore, what would happen is, if a tribe grew too big, what they would do is they'll often break up and divide and go different directions to ensure that each will grow and prosper. Now, what happens once you separate, and if they don't communicate regularly, they diverge. They emergently diverge, and we know this is how different ethnic groups emerge, and therefore this is how a nation over time can over big distances, who no longer actively communicate with each other. Their language so deviates from one lineage of the former group connection to the other, like the different Slavic peoples with their different languages, we went back 500 years. We'd even say the same things about the Germans and the French and the Spanish. But what happened to them was that when they got to the because of technology, because of a political reality of the state that unified them, it took control of the nation. It had the printing press. It had things like this that allowed for homogeneity of language that was imposed upon things, and it created a much more homogeneous culture. Prior to the rise of the printing press, and even prior to the rise of radio, you could say, there was big regional differences in countries and people of language within a big, large country, because of the nature of how the evolutionary character of how language would adapt to local situations, and the kind of subspeciation of the language, that if you didn't communicate across each other, they would not necessarily have this new words that would not be used by the other group, would differentiate one region from another region. And even how the usage of words and how words were pronounced and how words sounded could change because of differences. And what happened was that you had accents, and you had the rise of accents and differentiation. Now, what changed that was printing press created a common vocabulary, and then the radio created this common diction. So technology alters this. Now, the next stage here is tribe and empire. And I've talked about this before. The empire is just basically a combination of tribes, usually hegemonic, different aspects of tribes, different aspects of people. It's much more heterogeneous. We'll talk about this. And another thing we talk about is the birth of the political. This is the difference between that. In other words, the birth of the political was that, tribes, and I've talked about this in previous things, that the tribe is based on homogeneous kin-based relationship. It's kin-based relationship. In other words, emerges from the ancestors, your common stock. You're from a common stock. You have similarity of your common stock. An empire is that these different tribes, either a warrior, a band leader, or a tribe leader of a warrior tribe, is able to either convince or conquer other tribes under its authority, and establishes a great empire, great rule. This is the early empires. Political rule is an alternative of both these systems. It is an alternative to the tribe, and it's an alternative to the empire. Political rule is a form of society. It was the polis, right? We say that it started with the birth of the polis, and it emerged in Greece. It emerged because of what happened. A great disaster happened. We don't know when, about maybe 10, 11th century BC. A great disaster happened. A big giant empire was a natural disaster, led to a complete destruction. And what happened was apparently about flooding. It could have been maybe that who knows what happened there. It could have been that the water levels rose, and we know that in the Black Sea was one time a freshwater lake, and that all of a sudden salt water contaminated it, and that if you go down at certain levels of that, there are remnants of stone and stone houses that were stone little villages around underneath the water that because of the flooding. So we know that there was a great flood and that destroyed a great empire. And when there's and the wreckage of the empire, the survivors basically in Greece, what happened was the nature of Greek territory. People fled into the high and up the Greek territories, and the Greek territory is not flat; it's mountainous, it's cavernous, and it led to basically very localized differentiations. And that it was basically they were different, multiple different ethnic groups. Ionian, Peloponnese, there were at least 5 or 6 known, or 7 small ethnic types that were differentiated from each other. That when because at that time an empire was ruled by multiple tribes that were at one time were separated from each other, but the empire brought them together. Once the empire collapsed, these peoples remained in gathered together and just survived within the elevated areas around the Greek areas. And what's interesting about Greek life, you understand, is that the farming and the agriculture that was there, it was very difficult. It's not like Greece is not great farmland. It's not flat land. It's hard. You'd have these small patches of lands off hills on high areas, and what therefore created was these small networks of small farmer plots, which then led to the emerging of these people living these polises, or these areas of villages getting together for their mutual defense against other neighbors who came to steal their goods or steal their things. People who came around looking at their farms and their food to go steal it. Or take it for their thing, bandits and thieves. So therefore, this situation of everyone gathering together and cooperating together in order to secure their village's safety and security. This is the birth of the polis in that sense. The polis emerges as the consensual structure of the members of the thing, that everyone shared it together as like a common stock entity, as Samuel Feiner points out to be. Now, but the polis, or we can say in Latin civitas, or we say in English city, this structure was, in that sense, the ancient form. The ancient form. The problem with the polis was that it was limited. It had a limited construct. Its limit was that it was, otopos, means we can see it, we can talk it. In other words, that everyone knew each other. It was a koinonia in the sense that everyone knew each other, everyone kind of associated with each other. The problem with it, its size limited. It got too big, it would fall apart. So therefore, what often happened in the polises is that if it got too big, they'd break off and they'd go colonize someplace else. Again, very similar to tribes in this way. That in many ways, that the polis and the tribes have a similar pattern of limiting. In other words, something requires a limit to it. It's natural in the sense that even though it's an artifice of man's making, it still follows this limit, has a limitation to size and ability, and that these things form a structure. The modern version emerges with state, and as the state is the modern attempt to resolve this, because the problem with the city, as we'll talk, as we if you read things, was the rise of the next empire. Once you had these cities who formed alliances with each other, that then all of a sudden one city came to dominate other cities, or like what happened with the Macedonians came down and conquered the Greek cities, and then conquered Philip conquers the Greek cities, but then his son Alexander then conquers Persia, and it goes into India. Conquers not only Persia, but he also conquers the known European world, in the sense that the Greek world, Egypt and its control, then eastward into Persia, then into the peaks of India, right? Alexander's conquest his conquest created this huge empire, but at the same time, it died with him, and it reverted back to these large imperial structures. But what it was not an empire in the old sense, because what happened was that once the political and the constitutional form was adapted, the empires took it on. In other words, the modern empire, the empire after the rise of the city, what happened was you had an empire of political entities. First, the rise of the Greek city of the Hellenistic Empire, and then out of this, the greatest Hellenistic empire of them all, Rome. Rome was a republic, a city thing that, because of its strength over its neighboring cities and dominance and hegemony over its neighboring cities, formed a huge dominant alliance, a thing of alliance that became an empire. And then what happened was that this large control of Italy that led to control over its neighboring regions, and had all of a sudden it not only controlled Italy, it ended up taking control in Gaul and Germany, the east, west of the Rhine. Its footsteps on England, on Iberia, on Africa, on Egypt, on control of not necessarily didn't get into Persia, but on the steppes of Persia, and Greece. Okay, it conquered Greece, Macedonians in this area, and the Syrians, and then you had the whole Mediterranean Ocean. The Mediterranean Ocean became, our lake, the Roman lake in that sense. Roman Sea. So therefore, we have to understand that the empire, this new empire, was understood as a kind of a post-political construct. The state, what happens is the empire collapses, and that we talk about the rise of the state emerges, because the Middle Ages is this massive moment of all these different competing forms. We'll talk about that sometime in a different video. I've talked about it a little bit earlier elsewhere. But the Middle Ages is kind of a hodgepodge of every kind of thing, all these different competing forms all doing it, and that there's a world of competing authority, and that people thought this was a bad thing. And what they wanted was to establish some kind of order again, and that's the rise of the state. The state came as a solution to the problem of what happened with the of that, and it's coexistent with society. Now, I want to talk about the state because the state and society are fundamentally connected. Now, I don't know why it's I have this is the state and this is the community and society stuff. Again, this is the connection of Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, the difference of these things. Gemeinschaft equals community, Latin communitas, Greek koinonia. It is an organic, emergent from an environment of human livings together. It's accidental and emergent. It offers a variety of voluntary and involuntary relationships. It rests on culture. It rests on cultural tradition. It emerges from a reproductive nature of human beings that tend towards homogeneous and sameness. Again, that's from Durkheim's conception of mechanical solidarity. Gesellschaft, society, from societas in Latin. There's no Greek. The Greeks have no equivalent word. The closest thing you could have would be alliance. Okay, these are artificial. Created to fit need or want, based on consent to a highest degree voluntary creation. In fact, the word societas in Latin meant the kind of a business deal. If you engage, it was a kind of partnership. It was a partnership. Now, this partnership in Roman law usually meant in terms of one person for a business enterprise or some commercial enterprise. This would be a societas. Or it could be a partnership, a political partnership between one city and another city. And that's what, this is where societas emerges. It's more social dimension in Rome, because it was the relationship of Rome and her fellow other Italian cities. And when in a time when the cities kind of fought, they call it the social wars, right? This is not a social war in terms of society, in terms of within in other words, we understand a social war today as kind of culture war, or a fight between one part of the society and the other part of society. No, the Roman cultural law was one city, the smaller city is kind of resenting or resisting the power of Rome. But the idea of society here, it rises out of rational intentionality. It rests on rationality in law or legality. Hence, its idea of this is from Weber's conception of legal and rationale and legalism. If community is kind of more custom and tradition, in Weber's term of one of the type of methods of authority, here this is more rationality, legality. And then Emile Durkheim, the French sociologist, argued that society itself, the concept of society, emerges out of the division of labor within a given body of people that unites them into a unit or a group or community, as a social body. What do I want to say anything more about that? No. I mean, I only have to say one thing about it. I would say that Durkheim here is very important here because Durkheim argues that larger scale. What's interesting about society, community being organic, there's a limit towards it, like the polis. The polis and the city, the ancient city, and this community is something that has natural size limits. It can't grow too big. In other words, the community can, everyone knows each other. Everyone can, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone shares everything in common. It means, no, everyone knows each other to a degree. They know, you know their neighbors. You know who they are. You can judge them and assess them. You know, you could speak. You could speak for them in terms of dealing with other people. Whereas in a society, this is a much larger, much complex thing that only can happen because of the division of labor. The complex mechanisms of divisions of labor allows for the emergence of this larger scale community, but by which interdependence of the various parts of the various groups within it, because of the thing that or function that they do within the economy of the society, produces something that holds everyone together. Now, this is interesting. The Marxists would argue that the division of labor is a thing that leads to class division. In fact, this is the classic argument. Marx argues that it's economic division of labor and conditions of production and ownership produces class conflict, right? Produces classes and then class conflict. Durkheim would argue that we'll talk about this more, that it's not so much because of, you can't have a large scale society without division of labor, without the emergence of elites or representation. And therefore, that is why you can't escape those kind of things. And let's go next thing. This is the little graph about the state and society and what's the connection between them. And I think this is a very interesting thing here, because we have to understand that the state and society are basically the same thing. They're kind of Siamese twins that share much of their self together, and that these things are the two spheres are very connected. Now the question is, liberal societies want a division, some division between state and society, and non-liberal societies often would want that state and society to be almost identical. In other words, the liberal society wants some division, some space between state and society to allow for freedom. This is the idea, and the argument is that, and the ancient order. See, the thing about this is that the ancient order has no conception of this division between state and society, because the ancient polis or the ancient civitas was not a unitary construct. It was a construct of divergent, discrete parts. That's union. That the union was de facto because they lived together. They shared the same space. And often that what happens if the parts grew to the point where they no longer saw a common anymore, what would happen is that there would be either a conflict or a separation, a breaking up of the community into something else. This is not this nature of the state is a unitary construct. It understands itself because the state is the construct of the collection of all the members within it. It's a constructed whole through the consent of the members of its the constituted parts, the parts that constitute it. Now, what's interesting here is the problem of society. The society is the same thing. The society is the interrelated network of all the members who form the state. In other words, the state and society are this is why in Hobbes we can argue that the state and society are twins born by the social contract. When the social contract emerges from that, because before the social contract, there's no society. There's only individual willing agents in the state of nature who have nothing in common. In fact, the state of nature is that everyone is on their own and only self-help. And the only reason why they form society is the condition of the state of nature is that everyone has a right to whatever one wants. This would leads us to that. Therefore, if you want my drink, you have a right to it. Everyone who wants the drink has a right, and you have a right, a justice claim right to whatever you want. There's no, and in the nature, there is no judge to determine who's right, whose claim to it is true or valid. Everyone's is valid. So therefore, the question then becomes who can possess it, and that is based upon self-help. Everyone is left to their own selves to do it. Now, the problem with this leads to, the war of all against all, as Hobbes says in his Leviathan. And this leads us to a life of so horrible terror that we wish to escape it. This is a problem with anarchy. And this is why, Hobbes' answer about is actually the argument everyone should use against anarchists. Because if there is no rule and no authority, then everyone can do what they want and they only have self-help. That means that you have the rule of there's no reason to invest, no reason to work. You're going to say there's natural morality? What natural morality? That, if the person who has no conscience will just simply take what he wants. So therefore, the anarchy always leads to tyranny in this sense, as Kolakowski rightly says. That tyranny is the handmaiden. Anarchy is the handmaiden of tyranny. The absence of power in anarchy leads to this basically an intolerable state. To enjoy freedom, one must have certain power, must have certain authority. Without some authority, there can be no freedom. But the inverse of that is if you have too much power, too much authority, then that ends up destroying it. So there's a very much a utility curve here on the authority and the use of authority and power. Because if you have nothing, okay, there's no utility, it's bad. People are not able to enjoy their freedom or to secure their freedom. You have to have enough power to secure and enjoy your freedom. And at a certain point, there's a point where you get to power, then all of a sudden it starts having negative consequences on your ability to enjoy your freedom. So therefore, this is actually my response to academic agents' argument in his book that he wrote on a couple years ago, which I wrote a review on. I think his wonderful introduction about power was simply wrong. This idea that I agree with him at the height of power, freedom is lost. So this idea that freedom and power are inverted relationships like this is simply false. That freedom and power goes in opposite directions. Not true. What happens is that without any power, there can be no freedom. And that therefore freedom becomes this point where at a certain point power gets too much. And that starts the positive thing of freedom, and you start losing it. Again, a utility curve, classic utility curve. So back to this point here, that sane society, this and this model are these mutual constructual consents of consent that are fundamentally interconnected. The only difference in liberal society minds is that there's space between the two. right? That this is the idea of free society or an open liberal society. The state has limited construction or control on all the choices and decisions that we engage in. The problem here is that we think of the private public, right? The private public distinction, the state and society, private public, and this is not necessarily true, because society is as much a public sphere as the state is a public sphere. Both the state and the society are public spheres. Okay, the private is the personal or the household in that sense. So therefore, neither the state and society model really does an adequate account of this, and therefore this forces us to rethink many of these things. And I'm not a fan of the theory of the state in this sense. Now, let me turn to the next slide. And again, I've talked about this before, the types of rule in a previous post. And this is, again, economic rule, paternal rule, despotic rule, and political rule. It's the question of who, in other words, who's doing the action, for what reason, and who benefits, okay? Economic rule is mutual benefit of the parties. Since a trade only has two sides, we'll talk about this some more. It's wholly voluntary. I know some people said, oh, it's not voluntary. I'm sorry, it is. The second you say it's not voluntary, then it's not an economic activity anymore. An economic activity rests on mutual benefit. All the parties must benefit. In other words, economic goods are satisfaction of want or need. In other words, the parties are engaged because they benefit, and they both must benefit. Because if one is going to benefit and the other not, or one is going to benefit at the expense of the other, then why would anyone voluntarily do that? There'd have to be some coercion, and that once there's coercion involved, it's no longer voluntary, therefore no longer economic. This leads us to parental rule. Parental rule is the rule of parents, right? This is tied here is that loving care, agape, the father's love of the child, father, parents, child. It echoes in the God's love of His creation and agape, right? Caritas in Latin, agape in Greek, love. This is involuntary in a sense that you don't necessarily. In other words, it's not always completely voluntary. The parents' love. It's that the children cannot parent and children. This is not a choice matter in that sense. Well, you can say the parents could not love their children, but in most part, you don't choose to be parent. You choose to be parent, yes, but you don't. The children don't choose to be born. There is the relationship between parent and child is one that is not a voluntary relationship, and because of this, and the relationship is designed in its proper sense. The parental rule is for the sake of the child. So the rule benefits. If economic rule, all parties must, the buyer and seller must both benefit. Okay, the engagers must both benefit, or it's not occurring. In a parental relationship, the goal is the good of the child, the good of the ruled. We flip this over to despotic rule. This is the rule over. This is the rule over slaves. This is the despotic Greek word. It means mastery. It means the rule of ruling slaves. It benefits rulers and masters. The slave and the subject, if they benefit at all, it's only accidental. This is involuntary. No one would voluntarily be a slave, because why would someone voluntarily engage in activities or service that they were not going to be able to benefit from? That you work, but the master eats. Okay, and for this to work, this requires coercion, coercive rule over another for your benefit. Okay. Now, people say, but parental rule is coercion. But the purpose of the coercion in parental rule is simply because to force the child to do what's good is good, and it is the benefit of the good, unless the parent is mistaken and is abusing it. So remember, the abuse of the relationship does not deny the validity of the relationship. The type of rule that, in other words, just because there's parents who abuse their children doesn't make all parental rule and that's what's wrong with the argument about patriarchy by the feminists and the left. That, patriarchy means abusing women and things like children. No, that is not patriarchy. That's the abuse. That is a violation of the patriarchal order, not the patriarchal order, the patriotic order itself. Because the purpose of the patriarchy is the benefit of the rule, not the oppression. Because if that was the case, then it would not be paternal rule; it'd be despotic rule. Okay. Therefore, this is why the abuse of paternal rule becomes despotic rule, like how the abuse of economic rule becomes despotic rule. Okay, and likewise, the last political rule. Political rule echoes the economic rule, and again, it's a mutual benefit from the all. It is unlike the economics. It's not purely voluntary. There's also the involuntary here. Political rule is the rule over equals or relative equals, where one is both ruled and ruled in turn. The idea, the principal part of political rule is the sharing of decision, where you have citizens. The one who shares in the decision is the ruler. There's, in other words, the ruler here are all the citizens who are in there. Now, citizens may be just the head of families. You might say in a situation of thing that the head of the family is the one who gets to be the person who goes to the assembly. So each household will set the head of the household will go to the participate in the decision. Maybe the older children may join in also. Now, political rule is a shared rule. Citizens who are not subjects, but those who share in rule and also who rule. I want to talk about this because this is where some of the discussion that was I overheard, we misunderstood something. The problem with the Marxist understanding of exploitation of labor here is that it does not adequately distinguish between slavery and free labor, which means free labor means the right of labor is free to contract. In other words, the Marxists say, the workers are exploited. Well, if they're exploited, that means what? It means, because their value is taught because of surplus value, right? For the Marxists, the fact of surplus value by the owners of production cheat and exploit the workers. Now, the Marxists deny that workers have freedom to agree or reject their work contract. They say that they have no choice. They have to work. Not bullshit. Workers have in a commercial society, you can opt to go to work or not. You can opt. But now this idea of free market or not free market, no, it doesn't regard. This is, free market only means that there's many buyers and many sellers. Okay, when you have a situation where there's only one producer or one buyer, okay, that's a different thing. That's not a free market. A free market means that there's many buyers and many sellers. There's competition. There's people who are going to be able to negotiate the price or change the price. If you have a monopoly, okay, that there's less ability, and you're kind of put in a situation. But even then, you could say no. You can opt to not get involved or do it yourself or not exchange. So therefore, we have to be very careful here because the Marxist understands this through the so-called dialectic process, that workers are just a new version of serfs. See, they accept, basically, Marx's dialectical materialism of the move of the class struggle and class warfare. It is basically not his. He's stealing it from Hegel. Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, his master-slave dialectic. So, and that is the master-slave dialectic is the dialectic of the movement from one where none are free, then one is free, all rest are slaves, unfree. Then the master-slave. Then the next is there's more, few are free, most are slaves, more are free, many are slaves, then most of few, are free. And the bigger, larger Greek movement, the few, some are slaves, then all are free. This evolutionary process of this conflict, which gets to the point where when none are free, to all are free, right? See, that's the nice Hegelian dialectic of structure. What Marx does is he materializes in terms of class. So what happens is, well, he says the peasants, okay, aristocratic landed economy, peasants, But the problem with and that what happens is the rise of the bourgeoisie, and then when from the peasants became workers. The problem with this is this does not reflect the historical record of what happened in the economies. Not everyone, not all societies. The problem here is they took the Eastern European, Russian example of the serfs and the peasants and understood them as completely landless. We have to remember that the peasants of Western Europe emerged because of a post-colonial existence of the Roman Empire, which conquered tribal peoples and made them into Roman citizens and made them mostly into slaves. Okay, that worked in the big lafuntas, the big plantations that the Roman economy of the empire utilized. And then when that collapsed because of the barbarian hordes in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, what happened was, well, my God, you had a 4th, 5th, and 6th different waves of them. But then what happened was that you had a collapse of the system, and that these people reverted to tribal realities. And what happened was that certain people took possession of landed estates and landed areas, claiming it as theirs. The rise of, in other words, the rise of lords and landholders who claimed the land, and the people's got into this, the whole idea of the feudal contract, right? Again, another discussion of feudalism sometime. We have to understand that the Western European construction of feudalism was not uniform. This is why someone's work like Alan McFarlane about the origin, his great book, The Origins of English Individualism, is a must-read to disabuse yourself. Or even Kuga, I can never say his name. My pronunciation. Coulage's land, the origin, the basis of capital. Again, Coulage is the great French classicist and a historical anthropologist, classicist and historian. Who gives us The Ancient City, his classic work on the Ancient City, gives us a fantastic book about the origin of property as the basis of capital in early society, not only ancient Greece and Rome, but also within the structures of the Germanic and Gallic tribes. That this idea of the Kaponkian idea that these tribes lived with communal property was this horseradish. The tribes lived as if they were agrarian tribes, had agrarian constructions. They had private property. And Coulage does a fantastic job showing the historic record of that existence of such property. And that the feudal world there was private property. The problem with it was that the serfs originally were kind of like slaves, the peasantry. In a sense, they were landless, and they ended up working as laborers. Therefore, they weren't necessarily, in other words, we have to understand they weren't slaves in that sense, except the Russian ones, the Eastern ones. The serfs were treated as property in that sense, where the European serfs, the peasantry, was not necessarily as treated property. They were not necessarily completely free to move about, but at the same time, the relationship was not it was a contractual one. And you can see what's so great about what Alan McFarlane does. He points to the historic records, the church records of England, which had, because of the Norman conquest, we have from 1066 onwards, they have exact records of every transaction of land dispute, contracting. Because you'd have to show it to the priest. The church would be the record holder. Local parish priest would be the place that would recognize and require for the crown, and it'd be the storage of records of all deeds, transitions of property ownerships, of bequests, things that were transferring any kind of land or property or things like this. These were kept and stored in the churches. And what happened was, because the king wanted a record of everything so he could tax it, right? So therefore, McFarlane and the historians in the 1960s and 70s who started looking at all these old records, all of a sudden discovered, oh my God, people were making, these peasants were, these freehold farmers they were more independent. They were not just staying within the household. Their children would contract labor to other farms, other household situations. They'd rent land. So the feudal contract was very much more commercial in the English context. So therefore, that's why it's very important to understand this. This is why the reality of here just makes this nonsense. Because the problem here is that there is a distinction between slave and labor. The labor has a contract. And because these people, the surplus labor theory that argues that, oh, no, there's exploitation here, because that's the other side of that mistake we'll talk about, is the idea that value is a construct of an objective reality. It's some objective value. We'll talk about that. What he says, I would agree with here. This is why, to understand the phenomena of alienization, the idea that this is why division of labor, this sense of the loss of self and loss of community in modern society, it would be wiser to turn to Tocqueville's understanding of individualism or Durkheim's understanding of anatomy than to Marx's division of labor. Because as Durkheim makes very clear, that modern society rests on the division of labor. So if you want Marx's conception, Marx is what Marx is doing, he's relying on this dream of, oh my God, how wonderful us hunter-gatherers were. Oh, let's return to this time of hunter-gatherers where we can just kumbaya nonsense. And that's that famous description of men in communist society where they could wake up, work, go fishing, do that. Now, that is the life of the life of the hunt, not necessarily the hunter-gatherer, because the hunter-gatherer life was much more horrendous and miserable. It is the romanticized version of primitive man, in this kind of Rousseauian romanticized understanding of the process. Therefore, if you want to understand capitalism and its effect on modern society, you don't turn to Marx. Because because due to the problems of his many concepts, it is not the best guide to turn. Those who are interested in sociological rather than economic understandings of the effects of capitalism and economic interactions in a capitalist system would be better served by Durkheim and Weber. And I think that is very much true. Now, this is where I'm going to get on the surplus value theory, and I'm already over my time, so I'm going to have to, people say, oh, you keep on talking like this. Well, here's the problem. The idea of something called surplus value assumes that value has an objective value. The idea that labor has the objective, in other words, labor has an objective value, that it has, emerges out from the labor theory of value, which is derived from Locke's argument about the natural right to property coming out from labor. In other words, in Locke's second treatise, he has this discussion of property. Where does property come from? And it's in here. He says that we have a right to property, natural right to property, because we work the land, we do something with it, we take it, we cultivate it, we do this, and then therefore it becomes our right, it becomes ours. And this is what he uses, this idea of a natural right to property. Right? This is because he wants to make that right, that property is a natural right that man preserves even outside of civil society, and that in other words, not because remember the Hobbesian position is that the guarantee is about your life and safety. Locke wants to add liberty and property to this. And I think this is because he needs to cover he doesn't want to suffer the fate. He doesn't want to be rejected by the British tradition, because the British tradition understood that property was tied to personhood. The idea of land, in other words, the owner of your property was as much as your person. And hence this is where the idea of the king's two bodies in medieval political thought comes. That the idea that the land is as much as your person, and therefore when you had to exchange your land, you had to alienate the land from yourself. In other words, you had to first alienate the land, make it alien to you. Hence alienization in Marx, right? And then what you do is then it can be sold and transferred. So the land is part of your property. This is why in Anglo-Saxon common law countries, there's much more punitive punishment for land theft or even trespass. This is why to trespass on your land is to touch your body, assault. It's like an assault. So therefore, Locke knew that he couldn't get away with the very limited position of Hobbes because the common law view would assault his view as an attack on common law, which it was. Hobbes and Locke's view is a positive law understanding, which becomes very much clear by the time Bentham emerges. But in other words, but Locke's view is not really it's not really a true claim. It's a rhetorical strategy to tie property rights as a natural right. The problem is that property is not something that exists in nature simply, but rather something that emerges when human beings form society. And this is something that even Rousseau hits out. Rousseau in his Second Discourses points that society emerges when some people claim this land is this thing as his or hers. We're going to be put, or this is mine. Once I claim it, and then other people accept it. Now they do so in this idea because they don't. In pre-social man, they're afraid of each other, right? That's the opposite of Hobbes. But he says that a society happens when private property emerges. Now, even Cicero in his and Diophices and other works makes it clear that property emerges not from natural right, but from civic right, of civic law. In other words, it's our social bond that creates property. Okay, now this doesn't lead us to this idea of common property. No, there is still going to be, in other words, if the purpose of the state is to secure the person and their individuals, then that includes their goods and services and their labors. So hence, this is why the idea of the social political world is that individuals and their property and their goods have to be somehow secured. It's not that property is a natural right. Is that property belongs to and necessary for a person to live, in this sense. But then again, the problem then is, what about people without property? And that's why there should be communism. No, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because that's a different argument. We can go have a big argument about von Mises and Hayek's argument of why or the nature of communist model simply just does not produce effectively because of the information model. There's no effective way. It's it's two problems. One, it's the no way to order preferences and prices collectively in any collective system. It's an information problem, but it also is a problem of the common, we call it the tragedy of the commons. In other words, any collective good, once it's collectivized and no one has ownership or responsibility for it, common goods always get destroyed. When something belongs to everyone and no one cares about it, okay? And that's the famous problem of this. So, as we said earlier, the rise of private property emerges with the turn of humanity from hunter-gatherers to the rise of agriculture. Again, hunter-gatherers community does not claim a specific piece of land, but follows the food supplies we talked about. Thus, the cultivating of a land that people stake out specific territory that they will cultivate to produce and produce substance for them and their neighbors. In fact, this is why what's wrong with the communist desire. The communist desire for the community of common shared ownership is perhaps a lingering memory of hunter-gatherer life. The nature of more advanced forms of human community produces more complex systems of social bonding. I.e., as I think Durkheim talks about this. In other words, he talks about the division of labor, systems of representation, the emergence of hierarchies and elites, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things emerge out of the networks of human bonding, and therefore, this is you're going to have very more complex societies, and that we are not. In other words, you have to take us back. You have to de-evolve man to hunter-gatherer again, and that would not be a good thing. That'd be a very horrible thing for human beings. Um, um, again, this takes us to the discussion of economics. Economics is nothing more, again, as the idea of a trade. We talked about it earlier. It's exchange. It's a mere aggregation of all the economic activities and trades. So it's every trade that merges in. It's aggregation. It goes all the trades of goods and services that facilitate the production of things or commerce of things, the services of things and services. Thus, the basic union of economics is the exchange. Therefore, the exchange is the buyer-seller. It is that point. And that what an economy are all the collective different exchanges. Example. I want to produce something, right? I want to produce a widget. What I have to do? We have to make the widget. So we have to go buy the parts and the things that constitute making the pen, right? The pen, the thing. We need to get ink, to make ink. So someone has to make ink, get the resources that produce the ink, that then sent, that ship the ink to us. We then have to form the plastic, then or make a plastic, get it from rubber or produce it chemically. We got the chemicals to produce it. In other words, all these processes then together come that everyone. You have what? You have the contract between the buyer, the person making the good, collecting the material, selling the material to the producer who melts and changes it, and then forms it. And then, in other words, every one of those, there's a labor agreement going on. Every worker is working within a labor agreement, contract between the employer and the employed. Then what they do is they cooperate to achieve some goal. In other words, every stage, I'm making an agreement between the buyers of the good, the buying the material, buying the labor, buying the service, and then I'm exchanging it I'm selling it to another person who then is hiring people to produce or change it, and then sells it to another person who's going to sell it for commerce in the retail end. And then the retail is the buyer, the end buyer is going to buy it from the retailer. Okay, all of these areas are individual exchanges, individual contracts of exchange, where the deal is simply a simple contract of I see something, I want it, I make you can do it the old form of bartering, but we create price systems. What the price system does is that it allows us to do this more effectively. In other words, we see the price and then we can say, I don't want it. We could, in other words, and if the pens don't sell, what happens? The owner will decide I need to get rid of these, so okay, I'm gonna lower the price. Okay, he lowers the price that moves the pen, and all of a sudden the pen becomes more opulent. But he still will have to make some profit, or otherwise he'll go out of business. So what he does is he asserts the likelihood of the risk he takes by taking this. And then he puts it. If it doesn't move, then he takes. He lowers the price to ensure that it moves. Otherwise, if he doesn't move, he's going to have to take a loss here but hope to make a profit elsewhere to cover this loss. Otherwise, if over the long terms of the service, he'll go out of business because he needs to be able to not only cover his costs, but he also has to make enough to live and to pay for his ability to live well or take care of his family and take care of the services, or to pay the people who gave him the money to invest it in his business to make sure they get their payments and their dividend of what they expect. So therefore, this is the nature of exchange. An economy is nothing but the barter, this exchange of buying and selling. Of lending money again. I lend you money. There's an exchange going on. I'm lending you money. You're going to pay me back. Promissory note. I'm risking it, so I'm going to say I want to pay an extra bit of money to me. If not agreed, you agree to this. Again, that's a contract, and therefore the contract between parties lead us to an exchange. So the economy is nothing more than this aggregation of all these individual exchanges. And an exchange always has two parties, buyer and seller. Now, we talked about this. Exchange is voluntary. They believe that the parties have to believe they're benefiting from it. Otherwise, there cannot be coercion or force involved. Else it's not an exchange, but rather theft, if taking goods, or slavery if using using labor, the labor work of others. In other words, if I'm using force, I force you to work for me. That's slavery. If I take your goods by force, or even without force, take your goods without your consent, that's theft. In other words, that is not an exchange. Requires that the consent be given, and you would not consent if there was no benefit. So therefore, see, they don't believe that back to my previous thing there. The Marxist doesn't really believe in free labor. There's no thing to free labor, because really there's no difference. It is we're still slaves. Everyone's slaves. There's either you're the master or the slave. And I think this is the irony of because in communism, you have the master and slave still exists. It's the party boss versus the worker, right? That's the nature of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Becomes the party boss, and the apparatchiks is the new master over the workers, right? That's the sad thing about this. This is why the communism always turns out to be a horrible, monstrous thing. The parties agree to this because they think they're benefiting. They don't have to, they think they're benefiting. They believe they're benefiting. This is why there's no objective value, because all values are simply that there's a point where we agree to it. We agree to it because we think we're going to benefit. We believe we're going to benefit. We have a range of things. And this is why an exchange can even be the parties can think they're screwing the other guy. You don't have to have good intention about this. I can be doing this because I think I'm screwing you. And as long as it's voluntary, and I could think I'm screwing you. You can't read my mind. He's thinking, well, it's a great deal. I'd pay more for it, really, because you can't read each other's mind. So because of that, you don't know what the other person is thinking in terms of, does he think, well, no. Because the second is that it wasn't in his or her interest, they would say no. No trade would happen. A trade in a game choice model, yes, no, two parties. Yes, no trade. No trade. Yes, no yes, no trade. Yes, trade. So a trade only happens when one out of four outcomes. Therefore, it has to be a situation of both parties having to agree. It's a win-win situation. Not a zero sum, it's a win-win. Otherwise, there's no activity here. Lose-lose, no trade. Win-lose, no trade. Lose-win, no trade. Win-win, trade. So therefore, this is the nature of economic activities. So therefore, what permits the exchange to go forward is the consent between the parties. And what makes the exchange just is because both parties agree to it. And given the absence of coercion or force, the parties are free to say no if they did not think they were benefiting from trade. Thus, the value of a thing depends on the agreement between buyer and seller. Each party has the range of price or worth of a thing in their mind. In other words, and in fact, this is the problem. We can value things differently. We have things we love, things our parents gave us. We would attach a value, an unpayable valuable to this thing that other people think is a piece of junk, right? Again, value is what we attach worth to something. Okay, we human beings attach worth to it. In other words, this idea that there's a materialistic objective value of something, nonsense. All value is social. All value is social, all the time. Therefore, it is a product of our agreeing to it. Hence, this is why now one will make this example. The one make a my little thing here is that one will make a counter offer. We will, other words, I make an offer. I will make a counter offer. Maybe I agree. Maybe the other person will say, okay, a different offer, and then finally both parties will say yes and agree to the offer or the existing counter offer or the current counter offer. Or they will say no and stop negotiating, or keep on negotiating until they get a situation where both parties agree, or they will say no and the exchange doesn't happen. When each party agrees, the exchange happens. Now, I'm going to use this example. Here is the example of the buyer-seller exam here, and I hope this works. I'm terrified this whole thing is not going to work from the point of view of what's going on here. The socio-political transaction versus an economic. Simple. See how easy this is? A socio-political transaction of 6 persons. For every person, they have to interact with the other people. So therefore, this person interacts here, this person interacts here, this person interacts a trade here, this person interacts with this person interacts with this person, and likewise everyone. So therefore, the relations here is 6. The possible game model is not 2 to 2. 2 choices, yes, no. 2 choices, no, yes, no. It is 6 to the 6th. That's how many possible game outcomes. Cooperate, non-cooperate, cooperate, non-cooperate. So therefore, what happens here, the nature, an economic activity is much simpler in its achieving a win-win situation than in a thing. This is anyone who knows probability says that once you get the increased level of this kind of probability model, the moment achieving any kind of majority, a condition where all could win, that's unlikely, completely unlikely, impossible. But even when a majority win set at this stage becomes difficult. In other words, it becomes exponentially as the number of n increases, n to the nth power, the likelihood of getting a non-compatible outcome, in other words, a majority win in the situation becomes it kind of exponentially gets off the curve. This is a famous, it's called McCloskey's chaos theorem, if I think I remember correctly about this. I'm just trying to remember something I remembered from my undergraduate political science course about the idea of the structure of probability of a choice. Now, I give this as an example. This is the difference of this. This is why economics is simple compared to social life. Social life and political life is a much more complicated model, and therefore economic modeling, this is why you can't really apply economic game theory models. That you can do it here, it can happen, but it's going to be a very complicated model, and it's not going to always work out the way you think it's going to work out. You have to introduce very arbitrary in other words, the options you get here have to basically limit options, limit choices. If every choice could pick an infinite, whatever he wanted, and they could be 6 different sets of wants, then it would never achieve a majority win situation in any simple way model as you get after a certain size of population. I think that's it. That's my point for the day. So, I mean, this is some of the thoughts I had. I think I'm ranting a little bit, so you can probably say with one way or the other you'd think you'd agree or not. So see how it goes. Okay, well, take care. Bye-bye.